Wow, yesterday, March 31st, 2025. What a day for news, right?
Yeah, it was pretty wild out there in the news cycle.
It really was. We saw so much going on, from talk about presidential power to what's happening in the restaurant world, and even a big fight brewing over how we fund one of America's top universities.
It's amazing how all these stories, while they seem different on the surface,
Yeah.
they all touch on these big questions we grapple with as a society.
Yeah.
Like, how much power should our leaders have? Where do we get our food? And what's the future of education? It's all connected.
It is. You sent in some great articles, and we're going to try to break it all down for you. Cut through the noise and get to what really matters.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so let's dive right in. One of the stories that really got people talking was this whole idea of President Trump maybe going for a third term.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
And we saw an NPR article yesterday laying out how some legal experts are seriously looking into whether there might be ways around the 22nd Amendment. You know, the one that limits a president to 2 terms.
Right, the 22nd Amendment. That was a pretty big deal when it was ratified back in 1951.
Yeah.
Especially after Franklin D. Roosevelt served for 4 terms.
Exactly.
It really cemented that 2-term tradition that George Washington started. So to even talk about getting around it is a pretty big deal for our democracy.
It is. And it's not just legal experts thinking about this. The NPR article actually quoted President Trump himself saying to NBC News that he wasn't joking about a third term and that there are methods to do it.
Yeah.
He even dodged a question about stepping down after a possible second term ending in January 2029 when he talked to reporters on Air Force One just yesterday.
Methods, you say?
Yeah, I know, right? Makes you wonder what he's got up his sleeve.
Well, one thing that's really important to keep in mind here is the specific language of the 22nd Amendment. It talks about a president being elected more than twice.
Okay.
So these legal minds your sources mentioned, they're really digging into scenarios that might not involve a direct third election.
That makes sense. So, like, what are some of the more unconventional paths they're talking about?
Well, one that really stood out was the idea of a president who's already served 2 terms becoming the vice president.
Right.
And then potentially taking over as president if something happened to the sitting president. Like if they had to resign or were removed from office.
Wow.
It sounds crazy, right?
It does.
But this idea was actually explored in a 1999 Minnesota Law Review article.
Huh. So it's not a completely new concept.
Nope. It's been floating around for a while.
So it seems like there's a lot of legal and political maneuvering that would have to happen for something like that to work.
Oh, absolutely. And that word elected in the 22nd Amendment, it wasn't an accident. Some experts believe that Congress chose that specific word because they knew using broader language might unintentionally block other possibilities.
I see. It's all about the nuance.
Exactly. It's those little details that can make a big difference when it comes to these potential loopholes.
And speaking of loopholes, Brian Colt, a law professor at Michigan State, called this a potential loophole. And he even brought up how Eisenhower, back in 1960, joked about maybe running for VP since he couldn't go for a third term.
Right, and your sources pointed out that similar what-ifs have been thrown around about other presidents, too, like Reagan, Clinton,
Yeah.
even Obama.
It's like a constitutional puzzle.
It is, isn't it? But it's important to remember that even the vice president route isn't a guaranteed way around the 22nd Amendment. You see, the 12th Amendment, which deals with the election of the president and vice president,
Yeah.
it actually says that someone who's ineligible to be president can't be vice president either. So that strategy would likely face a serious legal challenge.
Oh, that makes sense. The 12th Amendment was meant to make the whole election process smoother, right? Prevent those situations where no one could agree on a winner.
Exactly. They put that amendment in place to avoid those kinds of political deadlocks that happened in the early days of the country. So that specific wording in the 12th Amendment is pretty important here.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. But then there's this other legal expert, Stephen Gillers, a professor at NYU Law, and he suggests an even more complicated move.
Oh, yeah. What's he got in mind?
Well, he's talking about Trump, and his running mate, maybe Vance, was mentioned switching spots on the ticket.
Okay.
So they'd run together, win the election, but then the running mate would resign, making Trump president.
Wow, that sounds like something out of a movie.
Right, like a political thriller.
It really pushes the boundaries of how we interpret the Constitution, doesn't it?
It does. And Gillers also brought up another idea, Trump becoming VP with the approval of Congress if a newly elected VP were to resign. It's fascinating to think about how creative people can get with interpreting these rules.
It's true, but you got to wonder how controversial these interpretations would be if they were actually attempted.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Gloria Brown Marshall, a law professor at John Jay College, makes a really crucial point. She says the whole idea of the 22nd Amendment rests on the belief that everyone's going to follow the spirit of the Constitution.
Hmm.
So what happens if someone decides to challenge that assumption?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
It really gets to the heart of what holds our whole system together.
It does. And your articles made it clear that any attempt at a third term through these kinds of unconventional means would almost certainly end up in front of the Supreme Court.
Oh, for sure.
And with the current political climate and how the court is made up, it's really hard to say how those cases would turn out.
Yeah, it's a real wild card.
Yeah.
And Aziz Huq, a law professor at the University of Chicago, suggested that the court might even try to avoid making a direct ruling on the 22nd Amendment question.
Really?
Yeah, he thinks they might leave the decision to other groups like states or Congress during the process of certifying the Electoral College votes. And that would just add a ton of uncertainty to an already tense situation.
It would. And the NPR article pointed out that President Trump made these comments more than 3 years before the 2028 election. So there's actually a lot of time for a new constitutional amendment to be passed.
Right.
One that maybe clarifies the rules about term limits if that's what people want.
That there's enough support for it, definitely.
Yeah. It's a lot to think about when it comes to the future of the presidency. So much could happen between now and then.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's switch gears now and talk about something a little closer to home.
Yeah.
Something you might have even encountered yesterday. The world of restaurants.
Okay. Sounds good.
We had some pretty interesting and very different news involving Chipotle. First, there's a return of their Burrito Vault digital game.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
Seems like a pretty clever marketing move.
Yeah.
Especially with National Burrito Day coming up on April 3rd.
It's all about timing.
Right. The article we saw yesterday said that Chipotle rewards members in both the U.S. and Canada can play this game where they try to guess the secret burrito order. You go to this website, unlockburritoday.com, and if you're one of the first 500 people to crack the code each hour,
You win.
you win a buy one, get one free entree paid.
Nice.
And even if you're not one of the first 200 or 500, you can still earn 25 reward points just for playing. Not bad at all. And Chipotle's chief brand officer, Chris Brandt, mentioned that this game was a huge hit for them last year. They actually saw a record number of digital transactions because of it.
I bet.
This year, they're even changing the winning code every hour, which is a smart way to keep people engaged and coming back for more throughout the day.
It's like a little game of chance.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a fun way for them to connect with customers and boost their sales.
Absolutely. Okay, but now for something completely different involving Chipotle.
Yeah, this was a strange one.
There were some rumors going around on social media last week claiming that Chipotle was about to file for bankruptcy and that they were planning to close restaurants in 2025.
I saw that too. It was pretty wild.
It was, and it turns out those rumors started from a pretty unusual place, a Spanish media outlet called Union Rayo.
What happened?
Well, they were reporting on the closure of a different restaurant called Farmesa Fresh Eatery,
Okay.
but they accidentally used the Chipotle logo in their story.
Oh, no.
It was a case of mistaken identity.
Wow, talk about bad luck for Chipotle.
Right, and this just shows how quickly misinformation can spread online.
Especially in the world of fast-paced news, where things are constantly being posted and shared.
It's a good reminder to always double-check what you see online, especially when it sounds like a really big deal.
Absolutely.
So the article said that Chipotle's spokesperson, Aaron Wolford, quickly shut down the rumors, calling them false information and explaining that the whole thing was a mix-up with Farmesa Fresh Eatery. Chipotle even got an apology from the media outlet.
Good for them.
It's a good lesson for all companies, though.
What do you mean?
You have to be really careful about managing what people say about you online and be ready to fight back against false information.
Especially in the age of social media where things can go viral so quickly.
Exactly. Okay, so let's stay in the restaurant world for a minute, but shift to a different kind of story. Yesterday, we also heard that Hooters of America filed for bankruptcy in Texas.
Oh, wow, that's a big one. Hooters has been around for a long time.
I know it's kind of an American institution in a way, so it was definitely a headline that got my attention.
Yeah, so from what I read, they're planning to sell all 151 of their company-owned restaurants to a group that's backed by the original founders of Hooters.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that the 154 franchise locations aren't part of this bankruptcy filing. So those are expected to keep running like normal.
Gotcha. So when a company files for what they call Chapter 11 bankruptcy, it means they can try to restructure their finances while they're still in business.
Exactly. It's a way to try and get back on track.
And Hooters CEO Sal Malili wanted to reassure everyone, saying that the restaurants will stay open and operate as usual throughout this whole process.
That makes sense. They don't want to scare away customers?
Right. The article pointed out that Hooters, like many casual dining chains, has been dealing with higher costs lately. Everything from wages to the price of food.
Oh, yeah. Everything's more expensive these days.
And on top of that, people are just spending less money eating out.
Yeah.
It's a tough time for the restaurant industry.
It is. But what really caught my eye about this story is the group that's looking to buy Hooters. They're made up of some of the original founders and some existing franchisees who are already running some really successful Hooters locations.
Okay.
And they're saying they want to take Hooters back to its roots and make it more family-friendly.
Interesting. So they're thinking about changing the image of the brands?
It seems like it,
Aha!
which raises some questions.
Like what?
Well, Hooters has had a very specific image for decades.
Right.
So how do they attract a wider audience, maybe more families, without alienating their loyal customers who like Hooters the way it is?
It's a tough balancing act.
It is. And we don't know how much this deal is worth yet. That information wasn't released yesterday. Plus, it still needs to be approved by a bankruptcy judge. But they're hoping to finalize everything in the next 4 months.
So we'll have to wait and see what happens. It'll be interesting to see how they try to revamp the brand.
For sure. Okay, so ready for our last big story from yesterday.
Hit me with it.
All right, so this one's about higher education and the crucial role of federal funding.
Okay.
We learned that 3 federal agencies, the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the General Services Administration,
Wow, that's a lot of government agencies.
they've announced that they're going to review over $8 billion in grant commitments
Yeah.
and over $255 million in contracts that were awarded to Harvard University.
Wow, that's a huge amount of money.
It is. And reports from yesterday suggest that this review is part of a larger effort by the federal task force to combat antisemitism. It's being seen as a serious escalation of concerns about how Harvard has handled pro-Palestine protests and allegations of anti-Semitism on campus.
And this isn't the first time the federal government has taken this kind of action, right?
Right. Just a few weeks ago, Columbia University had a significant portion of its federal funding pulled.
Yeah, I remember that.
And the government demanded that Columbia change its disciplinary policies and give them more control over certain academic programs.
And didn't that cause a lot of controversy?
It did. There was a lot of pushback. And Columbia's interim president even ended up stepping down.
Wow.
So now Harvard's facing a similar situation. And the stakes are incredibly high.
So what exactly are they being asked to do?
Well, the announcement yesterday didn't lay out specific demands for Harvard, but it did directly reference the conditions that were given to Columbia.
Oh, so they're probably facing similar pressure.
It seems very likely. And Secretary of Education Linda McMahon didn't mince words in her statement about the situation.
What did she say?
Well, she said that Harvard's failure to protect students on campus from anti-Semitic discrimination and their supposed promotion of divisive ideologies over free inquiry have seriously harmed the university's reputation.
That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. Shows just how concerned the federal government is about this. And Harvard's president, Alan Garber, had previously acknowledged how much the university relies on federal funding for its research. So losing that money would be a huge blow to their operations and their future plans. In fact, Harvard had already implemented a hiring freeze and asked departments to keep their spending flat for the next fiscal year. They were clearly anticipating some potential funding problems.
It sounds like they knew this was a possibility.
It seems that way. And the article went on to explain that this review process is going to be pretty intense. They're going to be looking at individual contracts to see if any work needs to be stopped.
Wow.
And Harvard's going to have to provide a complete list of all its federal contracts, even the ones that weren't initially part of the review.
So they're not messing around.
Nope. But it's not just the administration at Harvard that's reacting to this.
Oh, really?
Over 600 faculty members have signed a letter urging the university's governing boards to stand up to what they see as unlawful demands that threaten academic freedom and university self-governance.
So there's some internal conflict over how to handle this.
Definitely. They're caught between needing the federal money and wanting to protect their independence as a university.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It is. And the Federal Anti-Semitism Task Force is even planning to visit Harvard's campus at some point, though they haven't announced a date yet.
So this whole situation with Harvard coming right after what happened at Columbia Really shows how much power the federal government has, even over these top universities.
Yeah, they could really use their control over funding to influence what happens on campus.
It makes you think about the balance between federal oversight and the freedom of universities to make their own decisions.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
So as we look back at all the news from yesterday, March 31st, 2025, what does it all mean for you? We saw discussions about the very foundations of presidential power and potential challenges to term limits, the ups and downs of a popular restaurant chain, and how quickly misinformation can spread online, the financial struggles of a long-standing brand, and the possibility of a major reinvention, and then this fight over funding and control at one of our top universities.
Yeah, it was a lot to take in.
It was. And these stories really highlight how quickly things can change in our world, how unpredictable our political, economic, and social landscapes can be. We hope this deep dive helped you make sense of it all.
Yeah, I hope so too.
So what stood out to you the most? What questions are you left with as we move forward? It's something to think about as you go about your day.
It is food for thought for sure.